Dun, 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 dun. Ah! Dun, 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 dun. Bun, 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 dun, 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 dun. What you've just heard is the start of the 40th Missile for the Masses. This is the Chaplain's Assistance Motor Pod. I am your host, Gary, and this is the podcast where I talk a little about the gossip and goings-on here at the Motor Pool before I take a closer look at a particular vehicle or playset from the G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero toy line from 1982 to the present. My bad cover of Van Halen's, not Van Hagar's, Jump should clue you in that I won't be talking about the HasLab Sky Striker that is currently arriving around the country. If you're tuning in for some sweet Grumman F-14 talk, well, this won't be that podcast. Tune in next time, Grease Monkeys, because I've just opened mine. I'm having a lot of fun with it, but I really need to do some good research on that F-14 Tomcat before I talk a little bit more about the Sky Striker and its 2023 HasLab release. This episode is dedicated to aerial combat, and it is a double feature head-to-head comparison / competition of the 1982/1983 G.I. Joe Jet Pack and the 1987 Cobra Jet Pack. Now, since I reviewed issue 300 with the guys from G.I. Joeberg, Order of Battle Pod, and Anything Joe's, I've kind of wanted to review the Cobra Jet Pack, as the Revenge Cobra Bat used that Cobra Jet Pack to bring down the G.I. Joe C-130. And then I remembered the G.I. Joe Jump, and it seemed like a perfect foil for the Cobra Jet Pack to bring a discussion for everybody out there. It especially became evident when I saw the 1982 box and it said Jet Pack and Jump was in parentheses. This has been in the making for a little while now. It's been pushed back a couple times because I actually had to purchase a 1987 Cobra Jet Pack. Don't ask me why. It wasn't hot top on my priorities of G.I. Joe vehicles to get, and the collections that I acquired didn't have it either. So this has been pushed back a couple of times, and doing the research for this podcast while the HasLab Sky Striker was en route, I'm going forward with it. To begin with, we'll take a look at and light review of both vehicles, and I'll start with the original, the 1982 G.I. Joe Jet Pack. It says Jet Pack on the box, and afterwards it says Jet Mobile Propulsion Unit, and then in parentheses, JUMP. At this point in the toy line, forced acronyms weren't quite being used, and it was really forced at this point. But you could just quickly rearrange the words in a military fashion to say jet unit, comma, mobile propulsion. There you go. Now you have your acronym, and it doesn't seem quite as forced. On the box for 1982, it is Grand Slam. It's Red Pad's Grand Slam. And, he's taking off. And in 1982, he is not included with the jetpack. In 1983, with the re-release of all the figures going from straight arm to swivel arm, the Jump came with Grand Slam, but this time his pads were painted in silver. And one thing is about the silver paint of this era, it does rub off quite easily. So that was kind of a downgrade for Grand Slam. But on the flip side, if you bought the HAL, you got Red Pad's Grand Slam. So here's an instance where you got a driver, the same driver, with two different vehicles, kind of like Matt Tracker and Mask. And I say that this is a little bit unique because we had Grunt in 1983 coming with the Falcon glider in tan, but also coming as a single carded release. So similar, not quite the same. So he was a pilot of the glider and a single carded figure, but Grand Slam was exclusively a driver for two different vehicles. Now, the other thing to note for comparison's sake is that, at least from the info I was able to look up, the Jump retailed for $4.99, at least in 1983, and was 2 flag points. Taking a look at the blueprints for the G.I. Joe Jump, one thing I want to point out is a lot of the blueprints are based on the base that comes with the Jetpack Jump. And I want to point this out because it kind of makes for an interesting comparison and evolution of the G.I. Joe Jetpack in future uses. Now, the base came in 1982, 1983, and as a mail away up until like 85, 86. One of those while supplies last things. I managed to get this as a mail away when I was a kid. I got into G.I. Joe in 1985, and I don't know if I would have had enough flag points in 1985 for this, but I definitely had enough by 86. And the big thing with G.I. Joe premiums, it was always while supplies last. So you never know when they still had some left over to send out to a kit. So starting off, we're looking at the base, and it's a little square base, and it has 4 little feet, and it has this big like console that hangs off the side where you hang your jetpack and the jetpack's gun. So the blueprints start off with, number 1, the hydraulic support legs. All right, that's cool. Now, the neat thing about these legs is, much like 1985's transportable tactical battle platform, is that these have 2 settings. And you can clip them down so you can raise them up. So it kind of gives it a little bit of a multi-surface leveling function. That's an interesting feature that they actually don't really point out here as I look at the one page of the blueprints that I got printed out. Next up, it goes to the titanium launch pad surface, which is basically like, it looks like a helicopter landing pad, a very small one. You can't even land a Skyhawk on it. And, titanium, that's lightweight. Seems like a waste of material that the CIA would have had to buy from Russia, but I'll digress on that. And then it goes to a lightweight magnesium frame for portability. So you already have this jetpack that's pretty portable in and of itself, but you're going to be hauling around this platform everywhere you go. So you stuff this in your APC and you drive around. It doesn't kill the gas mileage too much. All right, hey, pretty cool. Aluminum would have done the same, but doesn't sound as cool, I guess. And then we move to the box, this little station, if you will, that hangs off the side. And number 4, it's a digital data display screen. And then you go to number 5, the system status monitor, which when it points it out to the blueprints, it looks more like the keys of a keyboard, but maybe it's like a little digital graph. And then you go to the axis panel on the side, which really doesn't have much detail. And then it goes to the top, number 7, the recharger intake. Now, one thing I'm noticing about this blueprint, unlike later blueprints, is the numbers are all over the place on this. So it was more like they kept adding things as they were drawing this. This is one of those things where it's like, okay, we got something boring. Let's add a lot of detail to it. If they just call this a command center and tool storage, but we'll get there. But as I'm reading off, it's like, okay, you guys really spent way too much time on this thing. Maybe that's why it was $4.99. You have an access panel, and that's to the right of the data display screen. And then on the top of this, you have a recharger intake, which looks kind of like a little fan screen for an electric motor. And then you move down to the side on the left side, and you have the recharger link up. So obviously this recharger system has something to do with powering up the jetpack. Number 9, to the bottom of the left side, you have the tool case, and it's noted by a little wrench icon. So, hey, that's helpful. It works pretty good for that. Go to number 10, you have the communications electronics, which is basically, again, to the right of the system monitor. Starting to get to the good stuff. You have your 11, your laser blaster holster. That's where you put your laser blaster, obviously. And then 12, the laser blaster recharger. The laser blaster recharge unit, which is sitting on top of the toolbox. So, all right, so now you got basically a refueling station and the laser. Every so often I forget that this thing's actually a laser gun. Lasers, that'd be Flash. So here's something where instead of coming with Grand Slam, could have come with Flash. He was the laser guy. Way they described Flash was, he kept his laser on the target. He was able to stay motionless in firing his laser. And the same thing with Sci-Fi in 1986. Number 13, we jump right onto on top of the control unit again. You have the pressure release, and then a little forward, the pressure release sensor bank. Again, it's just detail on there that it's like over explained. But finally, at number 15, we finally get to the jetpack unit itself. And number 15 is the first aid kit, which is actually on the back bottom of the jetpack. So, and there's supposed to be a little sticker there. It's not present on mine, but that's neat. You can be in the middle of the air and you can need first aid, but probably should land first. And then you go to 17, which is on the left. Let's call it the nacelle. The propulsion sensor. That seems pretty explanatory. And then 18 on the right nacelle, and I'm using the Star Trek terms, it just sounds better, I guess. You have the propulsion unit, and then it says there's 2 hours of fuel supply and 150 miles per hour. That's pretty wild. You get to number 19, which is the power cord that connects the laser gun to the jetpack. And then you have 20, which is in the laser gun, the jetpack control unit. So the throttle or something. So it must be a kind of hand control built in with the gun. You finally get to number 21, which is the infrared sight, which is sticking off to the left of the laser pistol. And then finally, laser blaster range 100 yards. Now, quick thing about the Jump Jetpack, it does have one especially fragile feature I found. It's the infrared sight. The infrared sight is very thin. It's very easy to bend. Even storing it in the holster on the base could potentially, if you force it in and you're not careful, you could bend it as well. I had one. It was bent. I decided not to keep that one, and I've kept the one that I have here, and there's not even a stress mark on it. It could really be the detail that makes or breaks this piece in someone's collection. One thing to note that wasn't pointed out on the blueprint is when you're assembling the jetpack when it was new, the backpack is molded from 2 pieces that came glued together. What this does is it created a hollow point for the jet nozzles or the thrust nozzles, so you could actually almost put a fire effect or flame effect or thrust effect out the bottom of this jetpack. Also on the backpack, going to each rocket, jet, nacelle, is you do have hoses that come up from the center of the backpack, tee off, and then bend down via like a 90-degree flexible hose. It's an interesting detail. It's ribbed, so it gives it that realistic flavor to it. The laser rifle does have some detail on the top. It has almost like an arm clip for the forearm of your action figure, and has that, the pistol grip. So, and the detail on the top does look nice. Overall, the backpack gun combination is well thought out. It looks really slick and futuristic. That covers the jump from 82. So let's move on over to Cobra. And in 1987, Cobra got their jetpack. There's no acronym here, as I can only assume that Cobra's engineers didn't feel that their jetpack didn't need a fancy name for their soldiers or international clientele. On the box is Crystal Ball, also from 1987, not wearing a helmet or eye protection. Remember Cobra's motto, safety, maybe. The marketing blurb on the back of the box catches my eye. A Cobra recon officer ascends over Joe's encampment and escapes with aerial photos of a top secret project in this exclusive jetpack. It's pretty fancy marketing talk. I like it. The jetpack originally sold for $1.99, and it only came with half a flag point. In reality, this cost less than an action figure in 1987, and that's also reflected with the flag points being only half, where an action figure came with one. Taking a look at the blueprint descriptions, number 1 is the screener micromesh alloy jet intakes. And these jet intakes are like slash cut at like a 45-degree angle, reminiscent of 4th generation combat fighter jets. So the micromesh obviously is there to clean the air or block debris from getting in there. And then you move down to number 2, the quick stick, in quotes, velocity liftoff control. That's essentially the dual joysticks that are hanging out for your action figure to grab. And then the little control panel that the character will be staring at as it's strapped to the jetpack is the micro adjust directional control. It looks essentially like a little bit of a cockpit screen, and it's really nicely detailed for what this is. It's a good screen. You got monitors, you got buttons, which could also be, little idiot lights, and even a fuel tank like cap, reminiscent of what would be on like the Ferret from 1985. And this is what your action figure's staring at. The backside of this piece, it's molded in gray, is hollow. It looks like some reminiscent from the mold up at the top of this control unit, and it's kind of a little plain on the back. I feel it's very well detailed for what this piece needs to be. A lesser toy line wouldn't have spent the time on the mold for a $1.99 toy. The front of this little console cockpit thing is called the Layered Vibration Dampening Personnel Retainer. In other words, it's what your guy's supposed to hold on to while the big jetpack is strapped to his back. You move on to the number 5, which is actually the jet engines, which is called the double pack, in quotes, 5M per pound thrust turbofan engines. I had to pause and look this up. 5M. I couldn't find what this is. 5M per pound. Thrust is usually measured in newtons or pounds of thrust. So, not sure what this unit is. Safe to say, I think that's what they're trying to do, is tell me how much thrust these engines have. But M per pound isn't a proper unit for thrust. So, hey, it's the crazy math that Dr. Mindbender does. He was a dentist, not an aeronautical engineer. We go on to number 6, the Quad Blast, in quotes, 25 millimeter axial firing machine guns. Now, this is molded in the same gray as the control panel for your character, and they look pretty good. They look really menacing. I don't know where you're storing the ammo for these guys, but they're there. It looks menacing, and it gives the jetpack some real firepower. And, I like the fact that they're guns and they're not lasers. It goes to the rudder, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Then we got the internal barrel synchronizing relay. This is essentially a rectangular strip on top of the 4 Quad Blast machine guns. And it has some nice little detail on there. One thing to notice that the machine guns all have little sights on the tips of the barrels. Notice looking at it a little closer. And it's kind of funny because you don't need a front sight if you're not shooting it from by hand, or you're not behind the barrel of the gun. So neat little detail that doesn't need to be there. But again, we're already on the barrel synchronizing relay. So not sure how it's going to synchronize. In the old days of the biplanes, they would synchronize the machine guns so it wouldn't shoot through the propellers. So maybe what they're trying to do with these is synchronize the shooting of the Quad Blast guns so it doesn't affect the pitch or the yaw of the jetpack as it fires. We have the control surface computer, which is essentially behind the internal barrel synchronizing relay. Not really, that's a little circular thing on the left side. And then we have the missiles that are on each wing, and they're called the neutralizer AIM-44 air-to-air missile. So this is different than, let's say, the Claw, which I reviewed on an earlier episode, and those were bombs. These are actually missiles, and these are air-to-air. So this jetpack is designed, I would say, for air-to-air combat rather than air-to-ground, which I think makes it different than the G.I. Joe jetpack. But we'll get to that. And it's also, these missiles have more firepower than the Joe jetpack. So, this Cobra Jetpack it's way overpowered for what it is. And I'm here for this. This is cool. I'm liking this more and more as I talk about it. We get to the wings now. They're called the hydraulically assisted control surface wings. And I'm glad that they're hydraulically assisted because you don't really have much leverage for a manual control from the joysticks on the control beam or control bar. And the one thing is, I would say, these are coming out in that red plastic that the jet pods are, it's molded in the same, it's the same piece of plastic. They're kind of small for the size of the jetpack. Whereas you compare this to the Cobra Claw, which is a drone / backpack. These are rather short and stubby, so these aren't really generating a lot of lift. Based on the size, these are more for, I would say they're more for control than they are for lift. But again, this is a value toy for less than the cost of an action figure. So let's expand our suspension of disbelief to say, okay, these are the wings. These are providing your main source of lift, whereas the jet engines are providing the velocity to generate the lift through speed. We get down to number 11, which is essentially the rear of the engines, and it's called the multi-laminate heat-resistant engine shroud. And we get to the number 12, which is the swept-back vertical stabilizer / rudder. So this is the rudder of the jetpack. It's part of the same gray piece of plastic as the 25 millimeter machine guns. At the last point on this is the jet exhaust discharge ventilators, which is essentially, it looks a little bit like a masking device for the thrust. So this way, maybe it disperses the heat signature in a distinct pattern. And the Cobra Jet Pack does have a lot of detail on the top. You have lines and, some paneling detail on each side. And on the bottom of the jetpack, where your character's back would be up against, you have your backpack peg, but you also have like a simulated pad, that'd make it a little more comfortable for the Cobra troop or character to be strapped to. Again, like a couple controls and linkages that are molded into the red plastic just to provide a realistic look and feel to the Cobra Jet Pack. Now we are ready to pit them head to head in aerial combat. And just for the sake of argument, we'll say that the Cobra Jet Pack will be piloted by a generic Cobra Viper, and the G.I. Joe Jetpack will be piloted by any G.I. Joe, no Joe in particular, although we do know from media that Stalker in the comics was seen using the jetpack, and also in the cartoon, basically everybody used the jetpack, but a lot of emphasis on Duke, especially with the 1987 cartoon. And the categories for this would be fantasy. Which one's better in fantasy? Which one's better in reality? Which one do I like more as a toy? What are we going to do with that? And then finally is use in media. From there, we will determine which one comes out on top. So in fantasy, which one is better? So a lot of the fantasy comes from, how would these be used? I have these in hand. I got the Cobra Viper in the Cobra Jet Pack, and I got Stalker in the Jump. Stalker obviously is, in my world, he's a Joe. So he's taking out, he's flying around. The easiest way to be would be the Cobra Jet Pack is a very powerful, like a muscle car, way overpowered. It's heavier, it's armed, it's, it's powerful. It packs a wallop. Whereas the G.I. Joe Jet Pack is more like a sports car. It's nimble. Maybe not as fast, but, tight corners, maneuverability, and while it doesn't pack a wallop, it can constantly, with that laser gun, quick bursts, quick shots at its target. Now, the laser gun isn't a air-to-air gun. It's just a laser gun, so it can be used for, peppering ground targets or air-to-air combat. The Cobra Jetpack has those air-to-air missiles, and it doesn't say if they're heat-seeking, radar-seeking. If they were to lock onto a jump jetpack, which doesn't really have any radar defense because it's not stealth, I don't believe that there's any chaff or flares for countermeasures in the jump jetpack. I don't think the jetpack would have the jump would have to rely on its tight turning radius to outmaneuver the missiles. We've seen in the comic book where missiles will lose, the servos will die out from the intense G forces. Those kinds of turns in the jump jetpack would also require intensive training in resistance to high G forces. If the Viper fires upon Stalker, Stalker needs to be in peak physical condition. And of course, he's a Joe. Of course he is. Now, the flip side is the Cobra Jet Pack, based on its size, it's not nowhere near as maneuverable as the G.I. Joe Jetpack. So it's going to rely more on its firepower to fire upon the Joe. It's bigger. Stalker's going to fire at it with that laser gun. And it's not going to do a lot of damage each shot. So Stalker's going to have to constantly fire upon and potentially aimed fire on the Cobra Jetpack. So in this round, it's tight. But if these guys were head-to-head, I'd have to give it to the Jetpack, only because I don't know, other than Stalker or Duke, if another Joe would be able to fight off the Jetpack once it lights off a rocket or gets a lucky shot with the quad guns. It's tight, though. I mean, a good pilot in the Jump Jetpack should be able to outmaneuver and eventually score enough smaller hits on the Cobra Jetpack to bring it down. But the Cobra Viper only has to be lucky once, it seems, to be able to take the Joe out of the sky.
G.I. Joe will return after these messages.
Now let's go on reality, right? If these things were presented to the real world, the FAA, where would they go? Well, start off with the Jump Jetpack, and it reminds me of a movie from 1965 called Thunderball. In it, James Bond actually pilots a real jetpack, which doesn't look too unlike what the Joe Jump is. That's a huge point in the Jump's favor. In the Cobra's court, there's not enough wing to provide lift. So this thing would be kind of like strapping two jet engines to your back, and once you light them off, you're going to be going in a straight line. You might be able to turn left or right, but the wings, on each side, they're not really big enough for lift or provide yaw control. So it's not going to look too well. To jump back to the Jump, in the real world, these jetpacks really are called rocket packs, and they don't really do much other than the slow lifting in down. They're not really a one-man, Superman backpack. In this round of reality, the Jump clearly wins. Now, moving on to the toy. Now, as a toy, the Cobra Jetpack was released a couple more times, mostly known in the modern line, in 2009 as part of a Target exclusive set with an Air Viper, and then also in 2017 as the Cobra Bat Rocket Glider, released part of the G.I. Joe convention that year. Now, interesting thing is, this Cobra Jetpack became a rocket pack in later releases. Now, the G.I. Joe Jump as a toy would eventually become as what I would call a glorified backpack in future releases. It's gotten many releases. It was released with Starduster, and then across a lot of figures in the 25th Modern Era lines, and even with the retro O-rings. It has basically become a backpack. It has lost the laser gun, and also it has never come with the base again. But the G.I. Joe Jump is more iconic because of its larger use and popularity in media. But as a toy, it's had a longer shelf life, and it's also had more recognition, whereas the Cobra Jetpack became essentially an exclusive with 2 extra releases. The other thing that factors in is which one would I rather have? I did have the G.I. Joe Jump. It was a toy that when I restarted collecting, I wanted to find one, and I did. I found one early on. Now, as part of a toy, how many do I want? Well, the G.I. Joe Jump, especially because of the fragility of the laser gun, I only have one of the 82-83. I do have other spare backpacks. But what this points out is that the launch pad and the control box, over-explained enough as it is on the blueprints, they're not really that necessary. The big part that you spent your money on in 1982 and 1983, in 1983 it came with a figure, so it's almost like a deluxe figure at that point, is the backpack. Most of this toy is almost forgettable, whereas the part that you do remember, got released multiple times, even with O-Ring Duke with the wonky head. Now we'll move on to the Cobra Jet Pack as part of a toy. Here's one that, I had to hunt out because I wanted one. I hadn't gotten a lot of it. It wasn't really it doesn't seem to have really been a popular toy in 1987. But to me, there's a lot going on with this. This would be something that makes any Cobra Viper, any Cobra Trooper, heck, even Crystal Ball a threat in the air. How many do I have in my collection? Well, there was kind of an eBay screw up where I got one with a clipped wing that I didn't catch. So I have 2 right now, and one of them is complete. The other is going to just go into my parts bin and then eventually, get culled out. How many do I want in my collection? I think I'm good with 1. If I had somebody to play with, if my son was a little more into this stuff, I would definitely go for 2, maybe 3. It's small. It doesn't take up much room. It's rather durable. And let's talk about durability for a second. So the gray plastic on the Cobra Rocket Pack is kind of malleable. It's softer even after, the years. And it does okay. It doesn't have a lot of features. There's not many moving parts. The 25 millimeter machine guns do have an elevating feature on it. The control panel clips off easily to allow you to put on your figure on the backpack peg, and it clips back on. You put your hands on. It's rather ergonomic. And the missiles come off easily off the pegs, and it looks good. There's enough detail. It's a solid, little backpack toy. The Jump Jet Pack has a lot of detail in that base, and it does have the details on the backpack and the laser gun, but you're not really doing too much with the base unless you really like having characters having conversations before they take off. Grand Slam is strapping on that backpack, Stalker strapping on that backpack, and then maybe another guy in the motor pool is monitoring, let's say Clutch, it's like, okay, you're all topped off, you're ready for takeoff, Breaker, checking, your comms. So the Jump Jet Pack set becomes more of a set piece rather than the toy. The backpack becomes an accessory on the action figure, which the action figure is the toy. So, and this is kind of split. So the 1982 one with no figure is less appealing than the 1983, not just for the harder to find Silver Pads Grand Slam. And so that means as a toy, I feel the Cobra Jet Pack is a better toy overall because the toy is what grabs you, where the G.I. Joe Jet Pack is more centered around accessorizing your action figure that is the toy. So on this round, I have to give it to the Jet Pack. So right now, 2 to Cobra, 1 to G.I. Joe. Where are we going to win in use in media? Well, it's already been talked about a little bit already, but the G.I. Joe Jet Pack was used a lot in the cartoon. The G.I. Joe Jet Pack made a lot of appearances in the comic book. The famous pinup with Stalker flying around but with the other jets. He had a saying, "Ain't no lie, I love to fly." And then we get to the Cobra Jet Pack. What is its most memorable use in G.I. Joe media? Issue 300, where it blows up a C-130. Wasn't in the cartoons. It really wasn't really much in the comic book either. And it's hard for me. I'd have to really do some digging into which issues Yeah, there's not really any notable appearances in G.I. Joe media on either 3D Joe's or yojo.com. So the only thing I'm getting is that it was also available as a mail away with the Cobra Battle Barge. Hell, it didn't even have a commercial. So in media, the G.I. Joe Jump wins. So we're tied 2-2. Which one is going to take home in this battle of the jetpacks? Man, I don't know. This is tight. What say you guys? What do you guys? Leave a comment wherever you find this podcast. Find me on social media at Chaplain Joe Pod, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Man, I don't know. I might have to go, I'm really thinking about this right now, guys. Who's going to win? Who's going to win my dollar? And which one am I going to buy again? Ooh, man, this is tight. I think if push came to shove, I'd buy another Cobra Jet Pack before I'd buy another G.I. Joe Jump. That's it. That is the hottest take of 2023 so far. And that will bring us to the end of this, the 40th Missile for the Masses. I have been your host, Gary. Thank you for listening. If you haven't already, please review, rate, like, subscribe on whichever podcatcher you've just listened on, like Anchor.fm, our host, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Good Pods, Google Play, and other fine podcatchers. Doing this only helps to improve and grow this podcast. For more Chaplin's Assistance Motorpod, you can find me on social media at Chaplain Joe Pod on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. You can even find some little shorts I'm experimenting. Really funny one with Darklon recently just posted. The Chaplin's Assistance Motorpod is the strange, but not as stranged, nerdy little brother of The Pint, a pop culture podcast. They totally did not reach me by Jetpack to say that. With all that said and done, I will leave you with one final missile for the masses. Be decent to each other.